Hello, BookTube. As you know, we are approaching the midway point of November, and November is the home of Nonfiction November, one of the oldest and greatest BookTube events of them all. It's the brainchild of Olive at a Book Olive, and the aim is very simple: for you to read more nonfiction. Some if you read none, more if you read some, all with the goal of helping to try and scrape away the stigma that nonfiction gains, probably for most of us when we're in school, of being dry and boring or intimidating. It's not any of those things. It's at least as various as any kind of fiction, and every bit as inviting. It is not just textbooks. I know that I'm preaching to the choir here because a lot of you read nonfiction. I read lots and lots of nonfiction. I've always loved it more than the made up stories. And I thought for today, for Nonfiction November, I would give you a list of whoppers of major landmark, in my opinion, major landmark works of nonfiction, in case you wanted to sort of start to build a spine around which you can clothe all of your own particular interests in nonfiction. So I went back centuries and developed a list of 10 or so books, 10 or so works of nonfiction that I think you should put on your list. And the main reason I think you should is because a lot of these are very important books, but the reason they're on the list is because how readable they are. These are all invitingly readable. They are all standalone antidotes to the idea that all nonfiction is boring. So we want to start. We'll go back to AD 400 with the Confessions of St. Augustine, which is an amazing work. I would argue one of, if not the most amazing works to come out of the broad church ancient world. Writers, historians tend to draw down the curtain on the ancient world around the time of St. Augustine. And I don't know if that's not partially because he's such the quintessential tough act to follow. But Confessions is his spiritual autobiography. It's a remarkably candid and involving personal story of his life, his grappling with faith, his conversion to Christianity, and it has a number of great translations in the 21st century. You don't have to look far. I guarantee you that whatever English language translation of it exists in your library will be really, really good, and I recommend it. Now, in all these cases, a tiny bit of prep work might be necessary. And you might be saying, those of you who are nonfiction skeptics might be saying, well, I don't need to do prep work with fiction, so isn't fiction superior? To which I would say, you most certainly do need to do prep work with fiction. It's just, you've been doing it your whole life. So you don't realize how many of the conventions you have absorbed just through your skin, just through multiple readings of multiple kinds of things. Most people don't read that much nonfiction. There are conventions, same way. One of them is that a lot of nonfiction builds history of its own. So in this, as in all cases, I would suggest, just do a quick read-up on Wikipedia or Encyclopedia Britannica or whatever website you like for factual dissemination of information. Go and read that. Or if you don't want to do that and you want to see which edition of the Confessions of St. Augustine is at your library, that translation, no matter what it is, will have an introduction. Read that introduction. But avail yourself of the book. It is a remarkable voice just coming to you from the ancient world, directly, like you were sitting in the room with the author. Then we'll move forward several centuries to The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli, 1532. Was when it was finally printed as a book. It's thin. So is the Confessions, but the Prince is a fraction of the length of the Confessions. And it's, like many of the books on this list, absolutely pivotal. It was intended by its author to be a whole bunch of things, none of which it is classified as today. But that doesn't matter. The point is, it's one of the most perceptive and intelligent and experienced thinkers about politics in the day, writing a treatise about what politics actually is. Not what it should be, not a moralizing tract, but what it actually is, how it actually works. And even in English, Machiavelli is tremendously fun to read. So that'll be the next one. Then we'll move forward a few more centuries to 1776, and that is The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, which, like Augustine, who whose book, the St. Augustine's Confessions, is pretty much the first heartfelt autobiography that we have, where somebody thinks that their own life story is worth telling in a dramatic fashion. Uh, and The Prince is one of the most crystalline, one of the first and most crystalline distillations of what politics actually is. And the same thing is true with The Wealth of Nations, where there'd been stabs and bits and pieces essays before then, but The Wealth of Nations is Adam Smith in gorgeous English, gorgeous prose, analyzing what economics actually is, what finance actually is. How is it that wealth and finance and broad-scale economics actually work? What are the underpinning assumptions and the unspoken agreements we all do in order to make this work? Even if you're not particularly interested in the subject of economics, I'm not, you'll love the book. You'll just love it. Read a little about it first, but then you will love it. Then we'll move on to 1792, A Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft, which is, again, beautifully written, passionately written, in a very cold kind of self-possessed passion. And as with so many of these other things, with St. Augustine in terms of spiritual autobiography, with Machiavelli in terms of statecraft and politics, with Adam Smith in terms of economics, so too with Mary Wollstonecraft on the personhood of women, which is kind of embarrassing that in 1792 she would need to write a passionate essay detailing that women are human beings. But nevertheless, she did have to do that, and it's thrilling, just thrilling to read. Every bit as much now as it was then. Then we move on to 1845, and that is The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass by Frederick Douglass. This is the first of the 3 books that he wrote about himself, about his own experience, and it's utterly remarkable. Again, like so many of these other books, it is almost a first. Certainly in terms of its popularity and the widespread nature of its distribution, thanks to the American Civil War and also thanks to the printing press, it was certainly the best known account of a former slave talking about his own emancipation, about his own life in 2 radically different modes of living, as someone's property and as a free man, told with stunning eloquence. So I recommend all of Frederick Douglass's books, but this first one was a bolt of lightning. Then from 1845, we move on to 1859, to a work of nonfiction that is the single most important book ever written. And unlike other important books that have been written, like, for instance, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle or Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, it's very, very readable. I know Harriet Beecher Stowe has her fans. I'm not one of them. I've never understood why people say that Uncle Tom's Cabin is interesting to read. Important, yes, but not. not. But 1859 gave us On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, which proposed a method of looking at life, that all of life is a product of natural selection, of evolution by means of natural selection, that all self-replicating organic molecules come under that kind of pressure to reproduce and have their genes represented in the next generation, and to adapt to their environment on a population-wide level, on a cladistic level. And On the Origin of Species would be interesting anyway, because it's really readable. You could say the same thing about the geological book by Sir Charles Lyell, Charles Darwin's friend and mentor. But On the Origin of Species talk about a bottle rocket. It split the world in 2. Suddenly, when you read Origin of the Species for the first time, when you read it for the first time in 1859, and you put it down, there were people all through England who read it and immediately realized what it meant. They immediately realized, well, okay, if this process is true, and if it accounts for everything that we're seeing, and if it always has, and if the Earth is 4-point-something billion years old, so that there's been plenty of time for this process to play out over millennia, then what about God? What about any God? What about any religion? there were plenty of people, not just English divines, but plenty of ordinary people who read this book in 1859, put it down, and suddenly asked that question. What does that mean? It at a stroke, turned every religion in the world into mythology. And it's a great reading experience to boot. So of course it had to be on this list. Then we'll move forward to 1926. To another one of the great works of nonfiction in the 20th century, Seven Pillars of Wisdom by Lawrence of Arabia, about the Arab revolt during World War I. That's the technical genus loci of the book, but the real joy of it is that it is written clearly in an epic register. No matter that the events are barely a footnote in the broader context of the broader war, it doesn't matter. The point is that it's a great work of literature. It doesn't have to be comprehensive about World War I to be that. It's a great work of literature in the 20th century. It's difficult to describe the sonorous combination of Arab storytelling and Homer. This author was very familiar with both, but it's difficult to describe it, but you should experience it. You should absolutely experience it. Then we go from 1926 to 1929, and we go from a fairly large book to a very small one. The single greatest work of nonfiction written in the 20th century, A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, which again looks at women's history. Here, unlike Mary Wollstonecraft, here there had been some gestures in the intervening centuries towards granting some sort of personhood to women. And it takes the arrival on the scene of an observer like Virginia Woolf for you to realize how small those changes were and how intolerable they are to a woman who wants to go to school or think on her own or write on her own. You had trailblazers. You had Aphra Behn. You had Frances Trollope. You had trailblazing women, lots of them, including quite a few, even in the literary world, whose names and stories aren't well known. But then you have Virginia Woolf coming along and being shooed off the grass by a beetle because she's sitting in the wrong place, or being told that there are only a couple of places where she's allowed to go and research. And looking at the history of women in the books that she finds in those places, and finding an appalling demonstration of history being written by the winners. In addition to everything else, A Room of One's Own wanders around a lot more than people who've only heard about it but haven't read it really know. But its central thesis, if you want to call it that, is that women need the same thing that men do in order to have legitimate interior reality. They need a little income and a space of their own. They can't be expected, Jane Austen notwithstanding, they can't be expected to achieve all of that while also darning socks in the middle of the living room with people coming and going. You wouldn't expect that and of anyone else, and you shouldn't expect it of them. It is a brilliant, brilliant reading experience. What it must have been like. It was originally given as a lecture. What it must have been like to hear it said for the first time. So we'll go to A Room of One's Own, and that is a very slim but beautiful work of 20th century nonfiction. And then we'll move from there to a gigantic work of nonfiction in the 20th century that is also brilliant in every page, and that is Black Lamb and Grey Falcon by Rebecca West, 1941, which on the surface is a sprawling travelogue of Yugoslavia and all parts south and west, but it's really about much more than that. It's really just a gigantic, sprawling tapestry of humanity. All of it written, it just amazes. It amazes me not only that Rebecca West could achieve that kind of narrative purity, that just shining purity of her narrative voice, but then maintain it for 1,000 pages. That just boggles my mind. No matter how many times I read or read in the book, I'm always boggled by that. Then we'll move on from 1941 to 1946. To John Hersey's book Hiroshima, which was originally a whole issue of the New Yorker, and is all about the bomb that dropped on Hiroshima and what the people experienced who were there, what it was like to go through. It's a work of reporting that's written in very dramatic fashion. And I'm sorry to give you whiplash here, because Seven Pillars of Wisdom is fairly long. A Room of One's Own is very short. Black Lamb and Grey Falcon is very long. Hiroshima is very short. So there's another little mischaracterization of nonfiction that it'd be nice to clear up. It doesn't always have to be miles and miles long. It can be short and still be tremendously good. Hiroshima will stick with you forever. Details in it will just stick with you forever. And then we move from 1946 to 1963 with The Fire Next Time by the great James Baldwin. The Fire Next Time is a pair of nonfiction works sort of added together in one book. One is much longer than the other. One gets more attention than the other. I myself am a big fan of the shorter of the two works in the book, but they're both incredible. All about race relations in America. Baldwin wrote it, as I mentioned, 1963. He wrote it. The book came out at a powder keg time, race relations in America, and Baldwin was the exact right writer at the exact right time. So there have been a lot of books on the subject of black and white race relations in America since then, but my strong you can come down on these things anywhere you want. You can start anywhere you want in your library or bookstore. But my strong advice would be that before you read any of those works, you read The Fire Next Time. Then we'll move on to more recent. We'll come forward half a century and do more recent works. The first one being Behave by Robert Sapolsky from 2017. This is a big book that studies humans. According to the latest research, according to the latest understandings of biology and psychology, what do humans do? Why do they do what they do? It's one of those cornucopia books where there's literally a jot-downable insight on every page. Just a feast for the mind. Just a feast. And then we'll move on to 2019, a slimmer work, unfinished, in the way that, for instance, The Fire Next Time, or any book on black-white relations in America, will necessarily be unfinished. Certainly there are many indications throughout the world that any book on the advancement of the cause of women is necessarily unfinished, as long as there are women who are chattel slaves in their village. And this next one is also, it's a marker. It's very well done, but it is a marker on what is clearly an unfinished subject. It's by Alexandra Minna Stern, and it's called Proud Boys and the White Ethno-State. And it's her study, to the limited extent that these groups can be studied without fear of the researcher's life, of the nativist white supremacist movement that is gaining enormously in strength in the United States since a white supremacist was elected president. Since that happened, these groups have been enormously emboldened, and they didn't lose any of that strength in the intervening years. So this is epic trouble that America is storing up, just building it in escrow, month after month after month. It creeps out in little places here and there, but it's building slowly in escrow until a reckoning comes. And before it does, it might be worth your while to learn something about it. And this book has a very controlled, again, cold eloquence to it that makes it really, really interesting to read. And then finally, we'll come down to 2020. And in my opinion, the most significant work of nonfiction so far written in the 21st century, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. And again, we're going from thin to big. It's a big book, and it's a study of what kind of a world we live in which our personal data, in which information has become currency. Far more important currency for most of the brokers in this stuff than actual money. And where all of us are surveilled almost all the time. And all the proceeds of that surveillance is up for grabs. The information gathered by that surveillance is for sale. And what that means. What that all means. So we're not talking about, Soviet Moscow, where citizens could be under surveillance, but it was the state that was surveilling them, and for a particular reason, and there certainly wasn't any money changing hands. Now, virtually everything you do online is tracked, followed, quantified, packaged, and sold. Virtually, as we mentioned the other day, virtually everything you do outside your home is watched by something or other at all times. Well, it's not neutral law enforcement agencies that are just, objectively doing that. That's information, that's data, and data is currency in the 21st century. And this book grapples with that subject with amazing wit, amazing insight, a sharp, uncompromising mind, and at the length that it deserves. I loved it. Absolutely loved the book. So I wanted to finish out the list with there, and I don't know if I would call this a starter kit for nonfiction, but these are works of nonfiction that won't let you down. They won't fall into the trap, the characterization of nonfiction being boring and dry. Not at all. And in addition to that, in addition to them being interesting to read, they're all, in my opinion, intensely important. So, two birds with one stone. So that's a nonfiction list for you to ponder on. Put them on your TBRs. Maybe go to your library or whatnot. A lot of the things that I've listed here are free online. A lot of them will be at places like Project Gutenberg. So you might want to try that as well. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. We'll do some more nonfiction November talk over the weekend, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.